Most free agent deals, you're overpaying because the rest of the market did not see the player at that value point, and the one team that got him did. If you end up looking back and we paid him $341 million and he produced $341 million of value, then that's a fair deal. We got what we paid for. Most of these free agents only are fair deals 30% of the time. So you're usually underwater. But it starts out this way, where you're actually looking pretty good. We've got some surplus value here, but then the back end is going to be really bad. So you have to build a roster that can manage that. That's where your young players are really important. If you're going to sign a guy like that or multiple players to deals like that, you better have players that you have 6 years of control that are going to be paid well under their production, because that can balance it out. Lindor, if I was guessing, I'd still guess that his value comes in under the amount of money he's getting. If you end up spending $341 million and you get $285 to $300 million of value, that's fine. It's a loss, quote unquote loss, but you got a productive player that you may not have had if you didn't give him that contract. You just heard me talking about Mets shortstop Francisco Lindor's contract extension, which was signed when I was the Mets GM. More broadly, I'm discussing my strategic thinking around roster construction when making large player investments. We'll get into more of my thinking on roster moves from the 2020-2021 offseason, my experience interviewing for GM, and my feelings about the unfortunate circumstances that led to me landing in the GM seat.
Champions aren't born, they're built. This is Deconstructing Champions, a podcast that explores the art and science of winning to help you elevate your game in sports, business, and life. And now, your host, four-time World Series champion and founder of Four Ring Sports Solutions, Zack Scott.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the show. Today we turn the tables and the interviewer becomes the interviewee. Mets fans have asked for more behind-the-scenes content from my brief time with the club. I cringed at the thought of talking to a camera for an hour, so instead I decided to recruit a guest host who could interview me and make the discussion more natural. Jonathan Van Halen is a Brooklyn-based stand-up comedian currently writing for The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. He hosts a stand-up show called Hot Gossip at Littlefield or Union Hall in Brooklyn. But what may be most relevant to you is that he's also a diehard Mets fan. And sometimes he even combines both passions.
We need to add celebrity examples to the page for Straight Ally. On the page for Straight Ally, there are no celebrity examples of what a straight ally is. So I got thinking, who are the notable straight allies of our time? I decided to compile a list. Number 1, Hall of Fame catcher for the New York Mets, Mike Piazza. Mike Piazza, he's best known for his baseball career, but he was in the news in 2002 because he was the subject for a blind item in Gawker that he and weatherman Sam Champion had bought a house together. Now, were they dating? Not according to Mike Piazza, who, when this rumor surfaced, immediately held a press conference where he publicly declared, "I'm not gay." You could be thinking, Jonathan, this does not sound like a straight ally. This sounds like a guy who's a little homophobic even. And that's what I thought, till I found out 10 years after this blind item, he wrote about this in his autobiography, where he wrote, "I found it hugely insulting that people believed I'd go so far out of my way to act out a lifestyle that would amount to a charade. If I was gay, I'd be gay all the way." And I was like, you know what? You go, Mike. Go off, straight king. That's enough to make him a notable straight ally.
Today we'll discuss my whirlwind arrival to the Mets, my thinking behind several roster moves, the complicated emotions about Jared Porter's situation, and more.
All right, Zach. As a diehard New York Mets fan, I got a lot of questions of my own and questions on behalf of the fandom as someone who's never really gotten to speak to someone who has had a GM position before. First off, I'm curious, what is the GM interviewing process like? Who taps you on the shoulder to let you know you're even a candidate? How did you get connected to the Mets? Give us a little bit of daylight on how that all works.
The Mets GM position was the first time I ever interviewed for a GM job. I had actually for years at the Red Sox I've helped multiple people prepare for GM interviews. One time I counted, it was like 8 or 9 different GM interviews, not different people. There's some people that had multiple ones, but people like Jed Hoyer, Mike Hazen, Theo Epstein, actually. Many people may not know this, but when he was on that little bit of leave, the famous gorilla leaving the Fenway Park in the gorilla suit story, he wasn't under contract with the Red Sox. He actually interviewed for the lead baseball ops person at the Dodgers when Frank McCourt was the owner. Basically, he could have had the job if he wanted it and just decided that that wasn't the right fit for him. But I remember helping him prepare for that, which was awkward because he wasn't technically my boss anymore, and I was trying to help him. I'd always been a bridesmaid, never a bride. I don't know if that's appropriate analogy here, but I had always been helping people, but never gotten an interview myself. And I hadn't really put myself out there for that type of thing. I think you do have to try to network to get your name in front of people. Although I have been told by someone at Major League Baseball that you'd be surprised how a lot of owners go about trying to identify candidates, literally Googling GM candidates, which actually was interesting to hear because I was never someone that was putting myself out there in the media. When I heard that, I was like, well, I got to focus on my search engine optimization or something because you got to put yourself out there. So I ended up putting myself out there a little bit, but mainly when the position was available, I reached out to some connections I have that are well connected in the industry to see if I could get my name in front of Sandy Alderson. I don't know if that's the reason why. And he never told me if that was why or if I was already on some sort of list. He was using Korn Ferry, the executive search firm, to help him. It's possible I was already on a list. But anyway, that's how that got started.
What materials are you supposed to bring in terms of a plan? Do you tell them so specifically what free agents you'd pursue that offseason? Are they looking for a big picture thing? I assume a little of both, but just so curious.
Yes, I did have a slide deck presentation where I talked about first kind of my values as a leader, just so they know a little bit about me and what I'm about and what kind of leadership style I have. So I went into that, and then I had a section called Current State of the Mets, and just talked about their current situation and looked at a multi-year payroll situation. First, I started with just kind of the major league state of the team and identified some potential areas to pursue in free agency, some potential trades to pursue. I also then talked more broadly about the organization, had done some analysis in preparation for it where I was ranking the Mets in the different areas of baseball ops. So I had an industry ranking of the Mets for the draft, for international signings, for player development, for trades, major league trades, and for free agency signings to say this is kind of where the Mets have done well objectively, and here's where they have struggled a little bit. And in the areas where they struggled, provided some color as to how I would want to address those issues. So that's kind of the oversight of the process.
How many rounds of interviews did you do?
I did 2 rounds. First round was with Sandy and the guy from Korn Ferry, and John Ricco was actually on the call as well. So we did a Zoom, was the initial interview. I actually didn't give the presentation then. My recollection is they wanted me to kind of wait on that, see if I was worthy of a second call, which is fine.
But make sure you're not crazy round.
Right. Then afterwards, it was with Steve and Sandy, and the guy from Korn Ferry was on there too, but more as an observer, so he's part of the process. But at that point, Steve's running that, asking questions. If he wanted to hear some of my presentation, and I didn't get through, I don't think I got through the whole thing, but I had emailed it to them ahead of time and said, I could start here, however you want to go. If you want to ask questions off of that, that's fine. If you recall, there weren't a whole lot of candidates, right? They kind of went through this for a couple times where there weren't as many people interviewing, right? Or people were turning it down. At that point, my understanding was it was just me and Jared Porter as the 2 finalists. We had worked together at the Red Sox for 10 years. We were good friends. So that was an interesting dynamic to be going head to head with a close friend of mine.
Were you shocked they went with Jared over you?
I had a decent shot at it, which was amazing because it was my first time. Here I am going into it thinking, I'm going to prepare for this. This is a great experience. Worst case scenario, I'm going to learn from it. I want it. But if I don't get it, at least, I've known people that have had to go through 7 or 8 different teams to interview before they got one of these jobs. So it's hard. There's only so many of them. I felt really good. Honestly, I couldn't have interviewed better from my perspective with the first interview with Sandy. And then with, if anything, I can be a little verbose, and I think that probably would be my own criticism. And I got some feedback from Korn Ferry on that as well. It's actually interesting because Jared and I compared notes after the fact. We didn't talk to each other before. In some ways, it's kind of awkward. You're competing with your friend. But after everything was done, we had compared notes. And then eventually, obviously, I'm there. So we talked a little bit about it. And he felt like he bombed the interview with Steve. And I felt like I nailed it. Steve reminded me a lot of this minority partner that I got to know pretty well. also a hedge fund guy. This is Seth Klarman at the Red Sox. And Seth asked really good questions, very smart guy. But once he got enough of an answer, he'd quickly move on to the next question. So in some ways, it was always rapid fire questions at you. And some people may get rattled by that, but I had done that so many times with Seth. That's exactly how Steve's style was. When it was clear I was probably going on too long, he'd cut me off and go to the right thing. He kept it moving, which was great. And I had no problem. Jared told me, he's like, yeah, that was rattling me a little bit when he kept changing. I started to think that I had a really good shot at it. So when I didn't get it, it was really disappointing. It hit harder than I expected because I went into it from the start feeling like this would be great. I think it's a really good situation and opportunity, but I know the odds are long on any one of these jobs, and I hadn't experienced going through it. I felt really good about how things went, but it didn't work out. So it was a bit of a gut punch when I didn't get it. It took a little while to recover.
And so you get a call, someone saying, hey, thanks for going in another direction. You go back to the Red Sox. Do they offer you an assistant GM spot after they have told you that they're not interested in making you GM, but want you to be part of the team? How did that all come together?
So the Red Sox at that point had Chaim Bloom as the chief baseball officer and Brian O'Halloran as general manager.
2 off seasons before, or off season before?
The off season before. So this was after the 2020 season. Chaim was hired before the 2020 season. Yeah. So I worked with,
because he had been a finalist for the Mets job, didn't get it.
Right.
Lost to Brody Van Wagenen.
When Brody got it, right. And Chaim's one of those people I had talked to before doing the process, because he's one of those people that had been through like 6 or 7 before getting the Red Sox job. It was good to have his perspective and any advice he had. After I didn't get it, the way it works is, they have to ask permission to speak to you for the position. The team has all this control over their employees. They can deny permission out of hand, and I could never get the opportunity to interview for GM, or they could grant it. So
Mets fans actually know that well.
Exactly.
2 years of waiting for David Stearns.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's true. It's been written about quite a bit with the Mets the last few years. So they granted me permission. I'm still technically working with the Red Sox. You get kind of shut out. I remember actually the last thing we had been working on when I had to go into this dark period where I was kind of cut off from the Red Sox, just in case I got this job with the Mets, was preparing for the Rule 5 draft in December. And we ended up taking Whitlock, who was a great pick in the Rule 5 draft. But I remember getting off the phone for my second interview, with the one with Steve and Sandy, and immediately calling into the draft conference line to see. I didn't know if we were going to take Whitlock. I knew the people on my group. I was in charge of kind of all the acquisitions, so pro scouting and analytics, like professional acquisitions was my area of oversight. So I'm calling in and not knowing, are we taking this? I'm hoping we're taking this guy, but I didn't know what the end decision was because I was cut out, and then we ended up taking him. But so I'm still technically working for the Red Sox. I call them to tell them I didn't get it. Jared got it. At that point, I'm under contract with them, so I am coming back. As far as I was concerned, everything was pretty much done with the Mets, and then Jared wanted to try to hire me as his assistant GM. And that's when it gets a little bit more interesting, the dynamic between teams, because I was assistant GM at the Red Sox. So now you're talking about a lateral move. Yeah. A lot of times teams deny permission on the lateral move. They have a policy, kind of an informal policy, like we won't deny for promotion, but we'll, like a legitimate promotion, which obviously a GM job would be. Sometimes people play title games, so they kind of have to figure out, is this a real promotion or is it the same job just with a fancier title? With that, they immediately said, hey, we don't love granting permission for lateral jobs, but you went down this path. It's one of your close friends in the game that you'd be working with. That's a new opportunity. You've been here for 17 years. And we've had a lot of success, and you've done a lot of work for the Red Sox. So they were fine letting me interview. That wasn't so much an interview. They knew they wanted to hire me because I'd already gone through that process, and Jared knew me really well. We talked about a few things. I needed to know what kind of role it was going to be. So it was going to be oversight of player development and research and development, so analytics and technology. And I had already done the second part of that before for a long time with the Red Sox, but player development was my first opportunity to have oversight in that space. And I was really excited about that because it was something I wanted to do at the Red Sox, but they decided that they'd rather have me have oversight of pro scouting and the analytics group, which was totally fine. So this was a new opportunity for my growth. So it was something I was interested in doing. And I had already kind of let my mind drift during the end of the GM interview process to thinking about moving to New York, working for the Mets. I started to imagine that, having those conversations with my wife about what that could mean for us. Talking to Jared, I got a sense of how he was seeing the role. I was excited about that. And then it came down to just kind of negotiating a contract to work things out. And it turns out I actually, during that process, had second thoughts and declined. I did that with Sandy. Sandy wanted to handle that since Jared and I are friends. It was just, and Sandy was the president. It was just like, made sense for him to handle that. And I just decided that it wasn't worth disrupting my family for kind of this opportunity, some of the other kind of parameters we had talked about. And so I called the Red Sox back and told them that I turned it down and I'm staying. And to my surprise, they kind of freaked out about it, which is when I realized, I don't think they want me to come back. And it was never said that way, but it was pretty clear, like, oh, why'd you turn it down? This is panic. I've got another person on the phone who I have a good relationship with to talk me through it. Are you making the right decision? This is such a great opportunity. There's upside, which there was, being Jared's right-hand man. And then it could be down the road that Jared could get promoted to president, and maybe I could be in line to be promoted to a GM role, that sort of thing that didn't exist at the Red Sox at the time. So I understood all that, but it was kind of a little bit of a shock to me. I felt a little pushed out the door. And so I talked to my wife again, and we decided that this was probably the right long-term move, because I didn't know, maybe that meant when my contract was up with the Red Sox, they were ready to move on. And I think the reason was I definitely strategically saw things differently than Chaim, and I've never been someone afraid to speak my mind and disagree, which is stuff, and he wanted that. He said, he wanted people to speak up and disagree. We disagreed a lot. I like Chaim. He's a good person. We just saw the future of the Red Sox very differently, and I wasn't crazy about the direction that we were about to go in. And so I think he just felt like maybe I wasn't on board. I don't know. I don't know what his reason was. I was on board. I cared a lot about the Red Sox, and always throughout my tenure was someone that spoke up when I thought we were maybe making a wrong decision, or I felt strongly about making another decision. That was always my role, was to kind of speak up and make that point and not be afraid to do that. And I never was. So maybe we just weren't a good fit culturally or whatever. So, it just was clear that I'm probably not his top choice for that role going forward. And they ended up hiring someone to replace me from outside the organization. So I made the jump, and I was really excited about it.
And you ultimately would get the chance to become GM, and it's not because Jared was promoted.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the Mets that you inherited. The Mets 2020, they're coming off a 26-34 season. They missed the playoffs in a year where everyone made the playoffs. They don't have a crazy amount of a core. They have Pete Alonso, who was Rookie of the Year. Then OPS dropped about 100 points. You got Jacob deGrom, who's coming off 2 Cy Young seasons and then coming in third in a shortened season, which, hey, he could have won the Cy Young. So tell me about this team you're inheriting. What do you think their strengths were? What were their weaknesses? What did you think the path forward was for the playoffs in 2021? Or was that not even the concern? Are you just trying to build a stronger infrastructure instead of having an immediate goal of making the playoffs in 2021?
No, we had an immediate goal of making the playoffs in 2021. So the way I looked at the team...
Sounds like Steve Cohen.
Well, the way I looked at the team from the outside before getting there was, it was interesting that Steve becomes the owner, publicly says, want to win a World Series in the first, 3 to 5 years, or whatever it was that he said. When I looked at the team, a lot of their best players were only under control for 2 more years. So I looked at it as, I think the best window to compete was actually those first couple of years. 3 to 5 might actually be a little bit more of a transition period as you start to integrate some of the young players at the top of the farm system, and obviously hope that we would add more to that through drafts and international or trades. That's how I looked at it. Was, no, you have at the time some of those guys signed, so to extensions like Nimmo, right? So you have some of these guys. I think Nimmo had a couple of years of control. DeGrom had an opt-out on the horizon. So I really felt like this was the time to compete.
And you thought it was a core that could compete?
Yeah, I thought so. I thought offensively, I liked a lot of the position play. I looked at the team as this team should hit, which, obviously they didn't end up hitting that year. But I thought this team should hit. Yeah. Their defense and base running is very poor. That's going to be an issue. I felt pretty good about the pitching. It's not that far off from competing. And this was, really ended up being the year that the Braves in the second half became the Braves that we know now, and knew that was kind of on the horizon, which is another reason to try to compete at that moment, right? They're probably going to own this division for a while. When I'm there with Jared, we end up making the Lindor trade as kind of our first big move towards really sending that message, right? grabbing someone that's only got 1 year of control, and we trade multiple players that have multiple years of control. So that was us saying we need to add some impact talent here, and shortstop was the clear area for us to be able to do that. And so that's why we were pretty aggressive in trying to get him. But yeah, I did. I really thought it was a 2-year was their best window to compete those first 2 years. Year two, obviously with some changes, they had that 100+ win season. So I think that was pretty accurate. I think the hard part would be transitioning, which is kind of where they are now.
I'm so curious from your professional standpoint, what was the perception of the Mets before you joined? Because online there's this meme, LOL Mets, that
Right.
bad things are constantly happening to them. Well, Mets, and they are. And I'm curious if that permeated in the industry. Do you look at this team and you're like, Jesus Christ, they hired a freaking agent to be their GM. He sells, the farm for an 86 win season. Now I got to clean this up. I just, obviously it's so different because Cohen taking over for Wilpon should theoretically change the entire chemistry of the organization, the entire culture. But I am curious just what your thought of the Mets was, what your perception is as someone who didn't grow up a Mets fan, who had never worked in the organization prior.
A lot of what you just said was the industry perception of the Mets. I mean, I found it amusing, the whole like Mets Twitter and LOL Mets. Like when you're not part of it, it's fairly amusing. And growing up a Red Sox fan, like I understand a rabid fan base, and I understand a fan base that it was this self-pitying, self-loathing type of fan base. I was a part of that fan base. I got that, and I kind of assumed that's probably what the fans are like, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Bad things always happen, like you said. So that was my perception of the atmosphere around the Mets. As far as the Mets themselves, they didn't have a good reputation. They had reputation as dysfunctional. Lots of voices in the room, some of them more informed than others, but powerful. So you had to kind of deal with it. Always seeing Jeff in the room. I don't know Jeff. That dynamic people would talk about. People from the Mets would talk about. So I had some insight into kind of what was there. Honestly, when it got close to the point where I knew I might be going there or thought I might be going there, either as a GM or later as the assistant GM, I'm doing my digging, and I could tell that I was walking into a situation where there was a lot of PTSD. It was really amazing. And I think part of it was, whatever the financial situation was off the Madoff situation, and they weren't spending like the market would dictate. And that includes on their people. The good thing was, like you said, Steve was in charge now, and Steve believes in paying really good people. If you lose good people because they get better opportunities somewhere else that you can't offer them, that's fine. You should be happy about that because that means they did a lot of good work for you.
So before you hop on board, the Mets signed James McCann to a 4-year, $44 million deal before JT Realmuto signs. What do you think of that deal? Would you have paid the sticker price for JT Realmuto? Why do you think the Mets decided to go for James McCann?
I wasn't thrilled with that deal. James is a fine player. I thought there was a lot of backup catcher risk rather than an everyday guy. He had only really played 60% of the time versus a lot of quote unquote everyday catchers play about 80% of the time. So I had some concerns whether he could handle the workload or not. I was asked directly in the interview what I would give him because that deal was happening and they were getting close to it while they were interviewing me and Jared for the GM job. And in the interview, I said 2 years. I thought he was worth about 2 years. It probably takes 3 to sign him. I figured there's probably a bunch of teams at 2 years, and the team that gives him 3 years is going to sign him. And then the Mets gave him 4 years, which seemed like an overpay from my perspective. The bigger picture thing for me was when I looked at free agency, I saw many more outfielders. Catchers are just hard. Good catchers are hard to come by. And I know Alvarez was in the system, and I thought very highly of Alvarez, that he would be an impact player down the road. So I get that there was some hesitation to kind of go all the way on Realmuto. The other factor with Realmuto was you hear all this talk about going to the robo-umps, right? And here's someone who's a lot of his defensive value is in framing, not knowing when that would be part of a long-term deal. It's probably going to happen at some point during that deal, so that value goes away. Doesn't mean he didn't have other value. So I think that's part of the problem with his market in general is teams are probably looking at that thinking like, how do we account for this? Or do we just ignore it because he's a good all-around player otherwise? But I thought looking at kind of the scarcity argument of an impact catcher, I'd rather pursue him. And then there were many more outfielders. So you had different options for outfield. They made the decision before Jared and I arrived to be more focused on bringing in an outfielder. Springer was of consideration at the time than the catcher, which again, I don't think that was necessarily the wrong decision. I just didn't think that they needed to go all the way to 4 years on McCann. I think he would have been there at 3 if they wanted to, and 2 is probably more appropriate. Understanding it's an auction, so whoever gets him is going to be paying the highest price. By definition, is overpaying what the market values a player as. But that is the market, right? So yeah, didn't love it, but I didn't really make much of a case in my presentation because I knew that it was pretty far down the road, or I thought it was. So I didn't want to spend much time talking about that if that was already happening. And I know from after the fact, I know Jared took the same approach. He's like, they're signing this guy. What's the point? Making a big deal out of it.
To make you question Sandy's baseball judgment that he was down for 4 years, $44 million?
I mean, I kind of understood it. I think there is some value in taking a need off the board, if that makes sense. One of the many things that are challenging about free agency is timing. And I know that was kind of his public answer.
Yeah.
Is that there's a timing issue, and we just felt like this was something that we needed. He had a lot of perceived leadership qualities and some defensive, he's going to fill that hole, but not be such a long-term deal that it gets in the way of Alvarez down the road. Yeah. Not that you can completely bank on that, but I think that type of player you can, because they're a rare, real top prospect. I understood it. I just think that it was a little more aggressive than it needed to be. But, someone could criticize me for nickeling and diming, right? It's like, well, is this really going to hurt the Steve Cohen Mets? People like to spend his money, right? That's such a slippery thing, right? If you have that mentality and you just always just get it done, check the box, all of a sudden you have a bunch of bloated contracts on the books. And that's the only way a big market team can really be in a really bad situation for multiple years. And we've seen it with the old Mets during like Steve Phillips's time, and Jim Henry with the Cubs. Those, you just keep paying and paying the Phillies after they won in 2008, and it's just all of a sudden you're trapped. We did it in Boston with Crawford and Gonzalez, and then the Dodgers bailed us out. But we were looking at, oh my God, what did we do? We've just killed our flexibility for several years. This is going to be impossible to get out of. We just got really fortunate that it aligned with the Dodgers, that they wanted to make some sort of splash. And so we got really lucky, because that could have screwed us up for a long time.
So before we get to Lindor trade and extension, I just want to ask a few other questions. Were there any serious extension talks with Conforto? And then trading Steven Matz at his lowest value, what was the thought process behind that?
Conforto was someone we did pursue in spring training of that year. So I'm in the GM seat at that point, talking to Scott Boris's agent, and we made an actual offer. It was a pretty sizable deal, definitely in hindsight, something that he probably should have taken. I understood at the time why he didn't. I do think this is one of those cases where Scott shooting for the moon usually works. And obviously it didn't in this case. They rolled the dice. You kind of bet on yourself. And then obviously things went really south for him that season, both at the plate and then health-wise. Steven Matz was the first deal I did as GM, I believe. That trade, he had a bad year. I recognized that it was obviously selling at a low point. There were some guys on the free agent market. Obviously, Ty Walker ended up being that guy that I thought was a better fit. My mentality was, sure, this guy's on a better one-year deal at reasonable dollars. He's a good buy low for another team. Like, I recognize that. It wasn't like, oh, this guy's done. There was some belief from people that had been there that he probably needed to get away from his hometown team. The narrative was about pressure. My first podcast episode was with Chris Young, and when he talked about pitching for the Rangers, he's from Dallas, he talked about feeling a ton of pressure. It was that narrative. Whether it was true or not, I could only go off of what I was told, but that wasn't a huge driver. It was really, if we trade this guy for players that we like or with more control, then we can then pivot and spend some money that we have that would still keep us on a luxury tax on either, the two pitchers that were still out there by the time we were negotiating that market were Walker and Odorizzi. And obviously we signed Walker to the 2-year deal, which was a really good investment. So that was the mentality, is can we get similar productivity? Even if he bounces back, can we get something similar out of a guy on the market? And if he has value, which again, low point, you may not, but he's a free agent after that year, right? So this is the time to see what's out there. Felt pretty good about the players we were getting back, especially Winkowski and Sean Reed-Foley. I thought those players were pretty good, controllable arms, saw them as relievers, future relievers, both of them, but there was a lot to like there. So you're addressing one area without really subtracting a whole lot, because the plan was to add from free agency a back-end starter, innings eater, which is how I saw Matz, but take that player and turn it into controllable relievers, which we were going to need to have. And then obviously then flip Winkowski in a deal that didn't work out, and Reed Foley's had some injuries. He is as good as I think we thought he would be, just the health problems have kind of limited him. He's a good arm, and I think he could still be a good pitcher if he can stay healthy.
Let's talk Lindor. Who keyed in on him? How'd you decide what you were willing to trade away? Rosario and Andres Jimenez, who had come off a pretty strong rookie year, albeit on a very small sample size, and then Josh Wolf and Isaiah Green. And was there ever another second piece in the trade who wasn't Carlos Carrasco, or was it always going to be those two players?
My recollection is that it was always going to be those two players. At that moment in time, Jared's in the GM seat. I'm in the one of the assistant GMs. We had talked about right away, like Lindor was a difference maker player that we'd like to get. He was the best fit, we thought, for the team to add impact to the roster, understanding he was only controlled for 1 year, but that we'd have the resources to potentially sign him either before he gets to free agency or be okay not signing him because there was a lot of free agent shortstops in that upcoming market.
Huge class.
Yeah, so we viewed it a little differently than your typical 1 year guy. And so we were willing, right or wrong, convincing ourselves that we could be a little bit more aggressive because we just thought it was such a good fit and we're trying to win. We liked Jimenez. Rosario, to me, is a solid player, but never kind of reached his potential with the Mets.
He had been 4 years, I believe, and had never really had his breakout at that point.
Right. And I thought defensively struggled a little bit at shortstop. And obviously this would have been an upgrade defensively and offensively. So that was fairly straightforward. So Jimenez was the top piece. And that was a tough discussion because of how many years of control he had. Didn't see him having the year he ended up having. Although I think there was some good fortune in that year. Balls falling in that you wouldn't expect to fall in with the same kind of quality of contact going forward. But you got to give up something you like sometimes. So that was really the key piece for us. And I think one of the hard things people sometimes struggle with when thinking about trades is it's a moment in time that you're making the decision, but your organization is going to change as it plays out, right? Like you're going to have another draft. You're going to have another international signing period. So your farm system's not just this one snapshot and then subtracting from it, right? It's subtracting for now, but adding value later. Yeah, you could just hold all your prospects and just keep adding and never subtracting. But there's risks to doing that too. So we made a calculated risk. I don't regret that trade, even though you could have argued in year one when Lindor didn't play at his best all the time, which also, by the way, is kind of to be expected. A lot of times that happens when a guy changes teams, especially going small market to big market. And then Jimenez making close to the minimum salary and being an all-star and producing at the level that he produced. You could say, that's a terrible trade, but I wasn't quite buying his performance. I think he's a good player and it's a really good fit for the Guardians. To me, that was one of those trades that I thought was a good fit for both teams.
I'm curious, who did Cleveland ask for? Where did negotiations start? They had their eyes on Jimenez the whole time? Were they trying to pry away Francisco Alvarez or any of the highly ranked prospects?
It's a good question. Like I said, Jared was running.
They wanted major league talent. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if there were players, like I could see if they brought up Alvarez that Jared would just shut it down right away. I don't even recall if they brought it up. Like it might have been if they did that he wouldn't even bring it to our discussion because he just dismissed out of hand. But I don't recall. I think Jimenez was the guy that they were targeting. It was fairly quick, fairly easy conversation was my recollection. Again, I'm not the one on the phone for that one, but it seemed to move fairly quickly where we aligned. Carrasco was someone we really wanted. We thought at his salary, we knew, he's aging, but his salary is reasonable. When he's healthy, he's got an elite mix of stuff.
Yeah.
And health is the big question with him, which makes him available, right? He's incredibly talented. We knew the makeup was really strong. And we just thought for starter depth, like this would be a good guy for us to get. And obviously it was a very mixed bag of what he provided to the Mets.
Interesting. So I'm curious, before spring training starts, you become the acting general manager. Jared gets fired in a pretty tumultuous way. And I'm curious what the process was like to get you the offer to be acting GM. Did they consider anyone else? Was there a chance Sandy was just going to do it? What was that conversation like? And how did you feel?
Yeah, that was tough. The night that the article about Jared came out, it was interesting because obviously he knew about it before I did, and he kind of went a little dark because he's dealing with that. And I was reaching out to him about some things because there was a lot going on for us. And I was just like, he must just be busy. I haven't heard from him in a while. So then I actually hear about it from a reporter that just says, I'm sorry, man, to hear about Jared. And so I was like, what is he talking about? So I checked it out and saw it and was in shock. So you have that emotion of just feeling awful, feeling sick about what happened, the situation itself, and the behavior, but then also it's a friend, right? So it's complicated because this is someone I do care about. It all happened really fast. So the next morning is when they fired him, and Sandy called me at we would have a daily meeting at 9 a.m. and he called me at 8 a.m. So an hour before the call, and said, in a very rushed way, like Sandy, because he's very to the point, matter of fact, he said, so we had to terminate Jared. I want you to run the meeting at 9. It didn't surprise me, obviously, that they fired him. It still was just like, this is happening, right? Like, you're just still trying to process it. You didn't have much time to process it. Okay, I got to like get myself together to actually run this meeting versus just being a contributor to the meeting. It wasn't my best meeting that I ever ran in my life. I think everyone was kind of somber because everyone really liked Jared and was excited about the direction we were going in. Those of us who knew him also cared about him as a person. You could also feel disappointment or disgust or about what had happened. You have all those emotions and it's complicated. And you have an organization to run. So I ran that meeting. It was pretty somber. I knew I had a kind of next day I'd have to pick up the energy level. Sandy kind of ended the call with, all right, let's have a higher energy one tomorrow. He was giving me a free pass because he knew it was just like head was spinning. Not how I saw being a GM for the first time. But yeah, so that was tough. That was really tough, but had a job to do. So that's where I had to focus.
I am curious because typically GMs, when they are hired, they get, their pick of the litter in terms of people that they will hire. They get to choose their own manager. You did not get to choose your own manager. You inherited Luis Rojas, who had managed in the 2020 season after another scandal, Carlos Beltran getting fired. If you had been hired under normal circumstances, would you have kept Luis on? Or would you have preferred to work with a different manager?
Well, it all depends on timing. I came on as assistant GM the day after Christmas. I think it was January 19th when I became acting GM. It's late in the offseason to make any kind of changes. Because of the ownership approval, the Mets kind of got a late start on bringing in a GM. You get to a point in the offseason, and if you want to hire people outside your organization, you have to go through that permissions process we talked about. People will say, no, I don't care if it's a manager's job. We're not going to let you talk. It's too late. We're not going to be able to backfill. If you had called a month ago, it'd be fine, but we don't have time. Sandy, and I agree with him, was basically like, we kind of just have to go with what we have. Now, I didn't know Louis at all. Jared had been investing time in getting to know him, but I hadn't done that yet. It was more like, I'm going to get to know him in spring training, which was just around the corner. I had a lot on my plate. I didn't end up talking to him probably till spring training. And I went early to spring training. I went the beginning of February instead of middle of February. I may have had one call with him. I wouldn't have made a change right away because I wasn't informed enough. I had talked to Jared about his early impressions and his conversations. Louis is an outstanding human being. So the whole time I was there with Louis, getting to know him really well in spring training, and then as the season got underway, I really wanted it to work because he's such a good person. Players love Louis because if you think about it, like the Mets core came up in the minors. He was a coach in the minors. They knew him pretty well. So he already had relationships, which I think is an advantage. He could have difficult conversations and still have the respect of people. So there was a lot of positive things going on. There were some areas where he didn't have exposure that were areas of development opportunity. So we talked through some of those things, like incorporating analytical work into decision-making, things like that. Some of it was new. Some of it wasn't. They had exposure to it. He had exposure to it as a coach, but some of it was new. So you're learning about what his decision-making process is going to be like. It was just a lot of getting to know each other and learning. He's learning my style, but there was a lot I liked about him. I guess I don't ever have to say anything about this because I wasn't there when they made a decision to move on from him. But yeah, I think that was the right decision. He was kind of put into that role similarly to me, like you said, and I just felt like it was probably not the ideal role for him at that moment, but didn't mean he couldn't be a good major league manager someday. I just felt like this. I'd love to have Louis on the staff in a different capacity. I know the Yankees people love him. I've talked to people there, and they're like, he's one of the best coaches, maybe the best coach we've ever had on our major league staff, which didn't surprise me at all. Because he knows the game. He's been around it his whole life. He communicates well. He respects players. He's a quiet personality, but he doesn't let players walk all over him. Like, he had to deal with some things, and I thought he did a good job in having real, genuine conversations with people and having difficult. Not everyone can do that. Have the difficult conversation if a player's emotional and be able to calmly just say, "Hey, I understand why you're emotional, but here's why we're doing this. Here's why that reaction's a little inappropriate." Like, just talk to people like adults and respect them. And he had that respect back. So there were a lot of positives there. But yeah, long term probably would have gone in a different direction. But I had no problem working with Louis while I was there. And in general, showing up that late with everyone in the organization, I think it's really risky to start getting rid of people right away. We ended up firing Chili Davis pretty early in the season. I knew Chili for a long time. My information on Chili was not the 2 months or whatever that I was there. He was a Red Sox hitting coach. I'd seen him work. There's reason why we moved on from him in Boston that I agreed with. I wanted to see, though, is how has he changed? It's been a while. I think he had gone to the Cubs. You give people the benefit of the doubt and respect to show you what if anything's changed. And in that instance, I felt like I had enough information and didn't see enough change there to make me feel good about moving forward with him. I think there's a danger in moving too fast. A lot of people want to bring in their own people. A lot of times it's their friends, the people they trust. The front office, there are a lot of good people there. I feel like sometimes it's happened. You could argue it happened after I left, where Billy has the right to bring in whoever he wants. He brings in a bunch of the guys that were with him at the Angels. I completely understand why you may do that. People you know and trust, you've worked with, you might get to where you want to be faster than that. At the same time, I also know that there are some really good people there that it's hard to make it fit together. There's redundancies and maybe stepping on toes, and maybe you're devaluing someone that's talented that's already there. But I understand why you'd want to do something like this. I was fine. I knew I wasn't going to be making changes that year, other than the openings that were already there when I showed up, like farm director, and I brought in a director of hitting and director of analytics. To me, that year one, it's tough because you're trying to compete, but you also want to get to know your organization. You want to get clear on your vision. So my thought was at the end of the season, we'd have an organizational meeting. Obviously, I didn't get to this point, but we'd have an organizational meeting in the off season at some point, usually closer to spring training because there's too much to do on the major league team before that. And you'd have this summit where everyone from baseball operations from all over the world, wherever they may be, your scouts, comes together and you get real clarity on what is going to be, the Mets way going forward. And so I was working on that with people there. I had ideas about what I wanted to do, but I wanted the input of other people to kind of formulate what that vision was and who we were going to be as an organization. And there's some things you kind of implement along the way. You don't just wait. But part of that was really doing a good job of evaluating the talent, the people that we had already, and not making snap judgments. If we acted on those initial things and, we got to get rid of this person, we got to get rid of this person, we'd have let go of some people that we actually thought they're going to be people that are going to help us along the way towards this direction we want to go in.
All right, let's cap this off with what capped off your offseason with the Mets, which was Francisco Lindor's contract extension. He ended up signing 10 years, $341 million, which started after the season that he was going to play. So it started in 2022. It was a somewhat oddly perceived extension at the time because the upcoming free agent class was going to have Javi Baez, Trey Turner, Corey Seager. You could have played out the whole year with Lindor to see how he responded to New York and see what you had. But You guys did a extension with him right before opening day. He said he wasn't going to negotiate during the season. So a few questions. Number one, seems like a high contract. Could seem like something where Steve Cohen got involved. What was your number that you thought would have been fair that you want to stay at? Number two, Francisco Lindor said he was not going to negotiate during the season. That never, ever strikes me as authentic. I don't believe that if you were to offer him 10 years, 341 on April 15th, he's saying no. So I'm curious how seriously you take these sort of deadlines. And then where was Steve Cohen willing to go with this? How high would he have gone with Lindor? Why did he covet this one player so much? Obviously, he was a special player, but he was coming off a 700-ish OPS season in 2020, albeit a shortened season. But why him of getting a contract that at that point, I mean, Trout had a higher contract in total value in MLB, and I mean, who had surpassed 341 at that point? Not many.
Yeah, I mean,
I guess Tatis was at 340.
Tatis at 340, which is why 341 got it done from my perspective, right?
Seems like it.
There's often a magic number for guys to get a deal done. It's something that I've always, in arbitration negotiations and whatever it is, it's like you kind of have enough conversations and you're like, I think this is their magic number. And then you have to decide, are we going to get there or not? What you do when you're trying to figure out what's the right, quote unquote, right number, which is sort of a made up concept, you're doing statistical analysis. You have people looking at past contracts, other comparables. It's not arbitrations. It's only relevant to use as a framework to wrap your head around what may make sense. I thought he was one of the best all-around players in the game, even coming off that year. But like you said, it was a shortened season. There were enough underlying indicators that I wasn't concerned that he was that much different than he normally is. But then when he shows up, He's got the great smile. He's a really good guy. Everyone likes him. He's got the blue hair. If I'm putting myself in an owner's shoes, and Steve's a brand new owner, and this is the first major deal on his watch, this guy's a great ambassador of your brand. There's diversity there. We're in New York, that sort of thing. There's just a lot of boxes that he's checking from a face of the franchise type of thing. People start imagining him on billboards in Times Square, that sort of thing, right? Well, I get it. He's running a business. That's not my job to think of those things. My job is to try to put the best baseball team out there to win. Everything else will take care of itself, right? It's easy to market a good product, but I understand it and respect that that's part of the process.
So did they not say a number first?
They almost never do. I'll give you an example. Like with Scott Boras, Scott doesn't give a number, but he'll talk about other players and he'll say like, I mean, he's better than this player. He's got to be north of this player. And some of the names that he throws out in their contracts, you're like, what? Like, that's outrageous. That strategy actually works to some degree, right? It gets you off of like a lower number, maybe. Some organizations get embarrassed to like put out an offer that's so far away from it.
Are you worried about Francisco Lindor in 2030? What do you think? What kind of player is he? Is he moved off of short? Is he not stealing bases? I mean, how do you think his skill set ages?
When you go through this valuation process, you're trying to think through all that. And this is the hard thing where there's like the public opinions versus the baseball ops opinions can be different, is that baseball ops has to think about how it affects every year of the roster that they're trying to build. And then you can only really go out so far. Like, you don't know. There's so many things are going to change. So if you're doing 10-year deals, you're like, I don't know what the world's going to look like in 8 years. It doesn't mean you just do it. I think there are some people that have done
even be an MLB. Who knows?
Well, unfortunately, I think there are some people that have been like, I'll probably be fired before that happens, so why should I care? And I do think some people do that, and that's not right. Like, you should always be doing what you think is best for the organization. And that's what I was taught by Theo and other people I work with. And so that's, to me, always been my mentality, is like, you have to do what's best for the short term and long term. And it's a hard balance, but you got to figure out what that is. So you're doing that. You have models that you're looking at how certain skills age, and that's factored into your projection, your forecasting of likely performance, likely injury. You have quality performance, then you have actual kind of bulk performance, being able to take the field. Most of aging is the latter, right? For position players especially. Pitchers will often fall off cliffs more than position players will, but position player will kind of have a steady downward trajectory after a certain age, and you're just trying to get the most quality ABs out of them because it's usually the bulk side that it's going down. Ability to take the field. Plays a demanding position, but plays it really well. He's on the good side of the defensive spectrum, so if you have to move him, that's okay. You're thinking of all those things when you get to that point. You're also thinking of inflation, right? So trying to do a present value calculation while you're also forecasting what this guy's likely path trajectory is, but you have to factor the fact that markets tend to keep going up. So what you're going to be paying on the back end.
Deal's a steal now.
Right. Yeah. And those are sometimes the arguments that are tough to make to ownership, right? And I've lived that with like Mookie Betts, right? It seems outrageous at the time, but I could look back at all 20 years I've been in baseball and point out a lot more deals that seemed outrageous that weren't eventually.
Yeah.
There's a lot that were bad deals. There are a lot of bad deals out there too, especially in free agency as guys get older. The top of the market for the purely elite players always seems ridiculous at the time. And then you look forward and it's like, was it really that bad? Because the elite tend to age better. Not always, but they do overall as a group. It's tough. These things aren't easy. I've always made the analogy of free agency. We behave like a robust housing market, a seller's market, and we behave as those kind of buyers. But at the same time, we're buying cars, right? So we're buying depreciating assets. We're not buying houses. So it's hard to balance that because we behave like we're buying houses, but we're buying an asset that's going to depreciate. That doesn't mean you sit it out when you're the New York Mets or the Boston Red Sox or the New York Yankees or Dodgers. You can't. You're not trying to get a trophy or a ring for being the most efficient payroll.
Yeah.
When you are one of those teams. You know, by definition, we're going to be inefficient. You just don't want to make too many of those mistakes that they compound. And like I said before, you're stuck. And then you're going to have a long period of failure.
So do you think, skip ahead to 2040, Francisco Lindor's contract will ultimately be looked at as a success? I mean, so far, of course, 2 years into the actual deal, he put up back-to-back 6 WAR seasons. Yeah. If he puts up, 30, 35 WAR over the course of this contract, which still means he's got to play at an elite level for 3 more years or what have you, and they can kind of fall off the cliff at any point. You're happy to have your name attached to that deal?
I'm fine with that. That happened on my watch in the seat. I think so far he's been exceeding what he's getting paid in terms of production. Some people would probably argue that, but given the position he plays, I think he's been really good so far. So far, so good. But like you said, it's a long way to go. Let's put it this way. Most free agent deals, because they are auctions, right? He never got to free agency, so it's a little different, but we treated it like he did to some extent. But most free agent deals, by definition, like I said before, you're overpaying because the rest of the market did not see the player at that value point, and the one team that got him did. If you end up looking back and we paid him $341 million and he produced $341 million of value, however you measure that, then that's a fair deal, right? We got what we paid for. Most of these free agents only are fair deals 30% of the time. So you're usually underwater. But it starts out this way, where you're actually looking pretty good. Like, oh, we've got some surplus value here, but then the back end is going to be really bad. So you have to build a roster that can manage that, right? So that's where your young players are really important. If you're going to sign a guy like that or multiple players to deals like that, well, you better have players that you have 6 years of control that are going to be paid well under their production because of the structure of the system, because that can balance it out. You know, when we signed David Price in Boston, we knew that in a vacuum, there's a 30% chance this is a fair deal, right? Here's why we can do that. Because we have Mookie Betts producing at a much higher level than what we're going to have to pay him during his control years, because we have, at the time, Jackie Bradley, Benintendi, all these young players, Devers coming up. Early years, they're not going to be making much, and they're going to be producing at a high level because we're also getting their prime years. We're getting their early years too, where there's an adjustment period, but we're getting a lot of their prime years. And so we're getting the best years of those players, and their production is going to exceed what we're paying them. You have to have that on your roster to balance these big contracts. And where the teams, like I've mentioned, the Mets of the past, the Cubs of 20 years ago, the Phillies after 2008, the Phillies are a good example. They kept the band together through their 35 to 40 years and didn't have a good enough farm system to manage that. So they're just stuck and really don't have flexibility. And that's the risk. They create a very risky roster that way. So those are the things you need to think about as you're going through it, and that's why it's challenging. But I would say Lindor, if I was guessing, I'd still guess that his value comes in under the amount of money he's getting. And I don't mean that he's as a criticism of him. It's just usually how it works. Is he exceeding 300? I don't know. I'd probably say no. He is so far. But I say when all is said and done, if you end up spending $341 million and you get $285 to $300 million of value, that's fine. It's a loss, quote unquote loss. But if he was productive to the level of a $285 million player during that time, like you got a productive player that you may not have had if you didn't give him that contract. At some point, it almost becomes, you don't want it to become binary, but it kind of does. This is the price that he's looking for to get it done. And if we don't, then we may not have him, or we may not sign one of the other shortstops. Maybe we get put off by Seager's number. That market was kind of all over the place, or some of those players didn't end up performing that well. Like a Story. He looked like he could have been a similar value at the time, but that's not how it's played out. Yeah, you would have spent less, but you would have also gotten less. If Story ends up being worth $140 million, that's great. It's a fair deal, but you had a $140 million player, not a $280 million player. So your team wasn't necessarily better off because of that.
Yeah. Well, I, for one, am glad that the Mets have Lindor. I think he's a great player. I think he's a great role model. I love watching him play. Hope that he ages well. But I think it's a good place to leave it. Zach, thank you so much for answering my questions. I appreciate it and would love to talk to you about the 2020 season at some point.
All right. Well, Jonathan, I appreciate your time. Thank you, and I do look forward to doing that. Thanks for listening to this episode of Deconstructing Champions. I hope you enjoyed getting a peek behind the curtain to learn more about what happens in a GM interview and how I viewed some Mets transactions in the 2020-2021 offseason. It was quite a roller coaster ride for those first few months. Sometime soon, Jonathan and I will cover the rest of my time with the Mets. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the podcast, please share it with friends and colleagues. You can find me on all social media platforms at Zack Scott Sports. That's Zach with a CK. If you work for a pro sports team and want to be empowered to win through data-informed decisions and elite front office talent, check out 4ringsports.com. That's FOUR ringsports.com. Thanks again to our guest host, Jonathan Van Halen, for his time, good questions, and passion for the Mets. Check out jonathanvanhalen.com to find out where you can catch his stand-up. Please join me next time.